An unassuming rancher uncovered a chasm on his property following a tremor, but the sight that met his eyes within would alter his existence forever and send shockwaves across the nation. The day had dawned just like any other on the Croft estate, a gentle golden light spilling over the level horizon, igniting the tips of the towering grain stalks and catching on the beads of dew that clung like jewels to the wire fences. Silas Croft had risen before the first cock crowed, his work boots cinched tight, his weathered hat tugged low across his brow. The ranch house was still, a hollow space filled only by the lament of old floorboards under his weight and the random protest of settling timbers. He had not yet switched on the radio. Mornings were for heeding the whispers of the land. He moved through his tasks with the placid assurance of a man who had repeated this same ritual for countless years. He scattered feed for the fowl, inspected the irrigation lines, and paced the boundary of the southern pasture, pausing now and then to let the soil run through his fingers. Silas had always held that a man's bond with his land was not a thing to be controlled, but a thing to be revered. This ranch had belonged to his grandfather, then to his father, and now it was his legacy. For 40 years he had tilled this very earth, and not one of those days had passed without him offering his gratitude for it. Yet there were signals, faint, silent, and deeply unsettling. The hens had not been laying as they should for days. The herd had become skittish, gathering close to the northern fence line in the deepest hours of the night, their snorts sharp as if something stirred just beneath their hooves. Silas attempted to write it off as mere happenstance. Animals, after all, had their own moods, but the disquiet took root in his soul like a stone lodged in the throat. He blamed it on the dry weather and the unusually balmy nights, yet something felt profoundly wrong. By the early evening the breeze had turned. It blew thick and warm from the east, carrying a peculiar tang on its breath, a scent that was part mineral, part chemical, and wholly alien. Silas stood on his porch as the sun bled out behind the rolling hills, watching the tall grasses dance in bizarre, disjointed rhythms. He could sense a pressure building just under the surface of the calm, a feeling as if the very world was holding its breath. That night, long after he had surrendered to his bed, the stillness was violently torn apart. It began as a subtle thing, a low thrumming that felt like a distant freight train rumbling through faraway mountains. Silas shifted in his sleep, half-conscious, questioning if the sound was born of reality or of a dream. But then the bed itself gave a brutal shudder, and the water glass on his nightstand lurched and shattered against the wooden floor. The walls groaned in protest, the old nails shrieking as the timbers swayed under an invisible strain. Silas bolted upright, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He had grown up with tornado drills, had witnessed trees twisted into knots by the fury of the wind, but this was something else entirely. The house felt as if it were shifting on its foundations, trembling like a living creature in agony. Books tumbled from their shelves, framed photos crashed to the ground, and from the kitchen erupted the definitive sound of breaking plates. He pulled on a shirt, snatched his flashlight, and plunged through the front door. As the ground bucked and rolled beneath him, the night air crackled with a palpable tension. The stars overhead seemed to flicker, as if the heavens themselves were in distress. Silas stumbled across the yard, steadying himself on a fence post. Behind him, the house creaked with a foreboding sound, its porch now listing to one side. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the violent shaking ceased. A profound silence descended, pierced only by the ragged sound of his own breathing. He turned in a slow circle, casting the beam of his flashlight across his fields. Fissures had ripped through the yard, jagged and deep. His barn tilted at a drunken angle, and the windmill beside it was ominously still. He stood in that deafening silence for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to restore a sense of order. But no sense came. The morning arrived gray and listless, dragging a veil of thin, long shadows across the wounded earth. Silas navigated his way carefully across the southern pasture, stepping cautiously over the churned soil and shattered fence posts. The land had been torn open in the night. He could see it from 100 yards away, A colossal gash had appeared near the old well, a deep and jagged wound in the earth that plunged into absolute darkness. This was no mere crack. It was a chasm. As he drew nearer, the smell struck him, wet earth mixed with something else, something sharp and acrid. It brought to mind the time lightning had struck a neighbor's propane tank, leaving a chemical burn that was low and metallic in the nose. He crouched by the precipice and aimed his flashlight downward. At first, he saw only rock and tangled roots, but then the beam of light caught something more: metallic sheens, a smooth, deliberate curve in the soil, as if an artificial structure had been violently exhumed. He leaned in closer, his heart accelerating, and understood that what he was witnessing was no natural formation at all. It was a tunnel, wide and smooth, arcing with an unnatural perfection into the waiting blackness. He took a staggered step back, the breath catching in his throat. The tremor, the agitated animals, the strange smell, it all clicked into place now, forming a picture his mind refused to accept. Something was buried beneath his land, something crafted by human hands, and it had not been there before. Silas passed the rest of the day in a haze, attempting to convince himself he was overreacting. Perhaps it was an old forgotten drainage pipe. Perhaps something left over from surveyors decades ago. But no one had ever spoken of tunnels. And besides, the shape of it was too perfect, too intentional. That night, sleep became a stranger to him. Every creak of the old house made him jump. The shadows in the corners of his room seemed to stretch and writhe. By midnight, he found himself outside once more, standing at the edge of the gaping sinkhole. The beam from his flashlight was simply devoured by the depths, swallowed whole by the inky black. The earth, it seemed, was trying to communicate something to him, and he could no longer afford to ignore it. He took one final deep breath of the cool night air, squared his shoulders, and turned back toward the house. Tomorrow he would call Marcus. If any man could help him make sense of this, it was him. They had weathered hard times together, and Silas trusted him more than anyone else left in this part of the county. As he reached the porch steps, he cast one last look at the wound in his field. Something about it made his skin crawl. The silence that enveloped it was too absolute, the air too motionless, the shadows within the chasm too profound. Whatever had broken open beneath his feet, it was not yet finished. And deep within his bones, Silas knew that whatever secrets the land had held for so long were finally, violently clawing their way back into the light. The morning arrived sluggish and gray, pulling itself across the horizon like an exhausted beast. Silas stood at the brink of the chasm, his arms folded across his chest, the brim of his hat pulled low against the biting wind. The night had offered no answers, only a deeper well of questions. He had lain awake, his gaze fixed on the cracked ceiling above his bed, cycling through every possibility, balancing risk against his own gut instinct. But as the sun rose, only a single conclusion remained. He could not turn away from it, not now. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed the only number that held any meaning in a situation like this. Marcus Flint answered on the second ring, his voice already coarse with his morning coffee and a healthy dose of suspicion. Silas kept his explanation brief, telling him a sinkhole had opened up on the south pasture, that it looked serious, and that he needed his help. He offered no further details. Marcus didn't need any. 30 minutes later, the familiar growl of Marcus's old truck echoed as it pulled into the gravel drive. Marcus emerged clad in work boots and a worn utility jacket, a heavy canvas duffel slung over his shoulder. His face, weathered like the land itself, tightened into a deep frown the moment he laid eyes on the hole. Without a word, he followed Silas across the field. The two men moved in silence through the bent grasses and unsettled soil until they stood together at the rim. "Hell of a hole," Marcus muttered, kneeling to inspect the edge. "Looks deep," Silas nodded. "There's more to it." "I saw something down there. Shapes of metal that don't belong." Marcus shot him a questioning glance. "You think it's an old well?" "No, it's too wide, too smooth. I think somebody dug it." Marcus peered into the darkness for a long, silent moment. Then he unzipped his duffel and produced 2 high-intensity flashlights and a thick coil of climbing rope. "Then I suppose we're about to find out." They worked in a practiced silence, anchoring the rope to the axle of Marcus's truck and testing its hold. Silas went first, rappelling slowly into the void, the flashlight held tight in his free hand. The earthen walls around him were strangely warm to the touch, layered with shimmering bands of red and gray that seemed to glow under his light. The air grew heavier with every foot he descended, thick with that odd mineral scent that now stung the back of his throat. By the time his boots made contact with the floor of the chasm, sweat was clinging to his back, his shirt damp beneath his jacket. He swept the beam of his light in a slow, wide arc, and then froze. The tunnel wasn't merely there, it was intentional. A broad, hollowed-out passage carved directly into the earth, stretching out in both directions, its walls unnaturally smooth and threaded with what looked like veins of black rock that seemed to pulse faintly in the light. Marcus joined him a minute later, landing with a grunt beside Silas. "Well," he said, his gaze sweeping around, "ain't no natural formation, that's for damn sure." They ventured deeper, the tunnel seeming to consume the sound of their own footsteps. The walls began to shift, the black veins becoming more pronounced, intersecting in deliberate geometric patterns. Silas ran his fingers over the lines. They were not random. They felt etched, carved into the soil with a clear purpose. Farther in, the edges of the passage were littered with debris, tangled roots, splintered boards, rusted bolts, and a half-buried section of pipe caked with dirt and the passage of time. Then the smell hit them. It came like a physical wave, sulfuric and sour, thick enough to make them choke. Silas gagged, pressing his sleeve against his nose. Marcus spat on the ground and cursed under his breath. "Something's leaking," he said. "Could be gas, could be worse." They pushed onward, stepping carefully to avoid the slick puddles that were beginning to form under their feet. The water was shallow, but it was coated in a yellowish film that shimmered like oil. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to push back against them, growing hotter, denser, and laced with fumes that made Silas's eyes burn. They reached a bend in the tunnel where the ceiling had suffered a partial collapse. Water dripped with a steady rhythm from above, creating stagnant pools around their boots. Silas aimed his flashlight at the ceiling and saw the same strange red rings embedded in the dirt, like scars branded into the earth. Something had been pressing from within, forcing its way out. Marcus gestured for them to halt. "You hear that?" he whispered. Silas strained to listen. At first there was nothing. Then, faint and distant, came a low, mechanical hum, barely perceptible, but distinctly rhythmic. It seemed to pulse from beneath their very feet, a steady beat that had no place in a location like this. His stomach clenched. "This is active," Marcus said. "Someone's down here, or something still is." They spoke no more. Words felt like a dangerous intrusion in that place. They turned back slowly, their eyes meticulously scanning every shadow, every glint of metal in the soil. Silas noticed something just off the main path, half submerged in the mud, a beam of blackened wood. He knelt, carefully brushing away the dirt, until letters became visible, scorched into the grain. Embielco. The rest had been consumed by time or fire, but it was enough. Silas stood and stared into the oppressive dark. "Someone built this," he said softly, "and they didn't want anyone to find it." They made their way back with caution, marking their path with small, deliberate scratches on the wall. The air felt even heavier on their return journey, as if the tunnel itself was reluctant to release them. When they reached the rope, they ascended in silence, their clothes and faces streaked with grime. The sulfur smell clung to them like an invisible warning. They sat on the tailgate of Marcus's truck, sharing a canteen of water and watching the wind stir the grasses around the gaping hole. "What do you think they were doing?" Marcus asked finally. Silas could only shake his head. "Something big. Maybe illegal. Maybe dangerous. You think it's oil." "I don't know, but it ain't farming, and it sure as hell ain't natural." They watched the field for a long time, neither man willing to voice what they both now knew. Something had profoundly changed. The land was no longer quiet. It held secrets, old secrets, buried deep within its heart. Before Marcus left, Silas walked back to the hole one last time, He stared down into it, his flashlight switched off. There was a subtle movement inside, slow and barely perceptible, like the earth itself was breathing. He stepped back and returned to the truck. They drove away with the windows rolled down, trying to purge themselves of the smell. But even as the image of his ranch shrank in the rearview mirror, Silas couldn't shake the unnerving feeling that they hadn't climbed out of that hole alone. Something was still with them, something that had waited a very long time to be found. The days that followed were marked by a quiet, simmering intensity. Silas moved through his life as if in a trance, the familiar routines of the ranch now feeling hollow and disconnected. He fed the livestock, mended a loose fence post near the north lot, even spent an afternoon cutting and stacking firewood in the shed, but his mind was elsewhere, perpetually circling back to the tunnel, to the charred piece of wood with its strange insignia, and to the impossible, rhythmic hum that had echoed from beneath the earth. Every time he closed his eyes, he was haunted by the image of the black veins in the walls, the oil-streaked puddles, the sickly yellow film that coated the ground like a disease. He tried to reason it away. Perhaps it was some long-forgotten mining shaft or a failed experimental irrigation system, but the facts resisted every logical explanation. That place was not a relic. It was active, alive in its own terrifying way. Marcus had grown withdrawn since their descent. He didn't come back to the ranch after that day, and when Silas called him 2 mornings later, his voice was clipped, almost offensive. "Still thinking about it," was all he would say. "Let me know if you find anything." Then he ended the call. Silas didn't push him. He knew Marcus well enough to understand the man wasn't frightened. He was furious. Furious at being deceived by the very land he thought he knew. Furious that something so vast had been concealed right under their feet. Silas knew he needed more. He needed answers, real ones, not conjectures, not theories. He wanted to know what Mbielko stood for, who had excavated those tunnels, and what had been taken from his soil without consent. But more than that, he wanted to understand how it had remained hidden from him. His grandfather had walked these very fields. His father had died on them. How could something so massive have eluded generations of eyes and ears? He started at the county records office, a squat brick building with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights on the outskirts of town. The clerk, a weary woman with half-moon spectacles and a cardigan far too heavy for the season, guided him to a back room lined with aging file cabinets. "Start with the land surveys," she suggested, gesturing vaguely toward a wall of yellowing folders. "If it's old, it's in there." Then she returned to her desk and did not look up again. Silas spent hours sifting through maps and deeds, most of them handwritten or copied so many times they were nearly indecipherable. He meticulously traced the ownership of his land back through the years. His father, then his grandfather, and before that, a landowner named Vernon Blake, who had subdivided the original tract in the 1930s. Nothing in the official deeds made any mention of underground rights. There was no reference to mineral leases, no notes about easements or exploratory drilling. But then, sandwiched between 2 brittle sheets of carbon paper, he discovered a survey from 1958. The map was crudely drawn, but Silas recognized the outline of his southern pasture immediately. A black rectangle had been marked in ink near the base of the hill, labeled simply as Sector C. Below it, in faded type, was a brief note. "Approved for exploratory shaft. Permit filed with Midland Extraction." His breath caught in his throat. Midland, the letters aligned. Not perfectly, but close enough. MBL could have been a later name, a corporate rebranding. He made a copy of the document and left the office with trembling hands. Back at home, he sat on the porch with the map spread across his lap and gazed out at the hills. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, and from this distance, the land appeared untouched, pristine. But now he knew better. There had been drills in his soil before he was even born, and no one had ever told his family. The sense of betrayal settled deep in his gut. The next morning he drove 20 miles north to the County Historical Society, a place where dusty files and long-dead headlines coexisted in an uneasy truce. There he met Elias Reed, a retired school teacher who had become the local historian. Reed was thin, almost skeletal, with skin like parchment and sharp blue eyes that seemed to hold too many memories. When Silas showed him the map and mentioned the name Midland, something flickered in the old man's gaze. "That name hasn't been spoken around here in a long time," Reed said softly, turning the map in his bony fingers. "They were drilling out here before the interstate was even built. Did it quietly, no fanfare. Most people didn't even know. My family didn't," Silas said. Reed nodded. "I'm not surprised. They didn't have to tell anyone?" Back then, most of the farmers didn't hold the mineral rights to their own land. Those were separate contracts, legal jargon buried in deeds signed under duress or, in some cases, not signed at all. They'd claim it was part of the public trust or state reserves or federal interest. You could own the soil, but you didn't own what was under it. Silas felt his jaw clench. "So they just came and took it." "They always do," Reed said, his tone not unkind. The old man led him to a filing cabinet in the back and pulled out a folder labeled Me Corp. Inside were photocopies of newspaper clippings, corporate brochures, and even a faded photograph of a drill site. Mud-slicked ground, 2 men in coveralls standing beside a vertical rig. In the background was a small house. Silas leaned closer. It looked exactly like his grandfather's cabin, which had been demolished long ago. The date on the photo read 1964. "They operated under different names," Reed explained. "Midland Extraction, then later, something called Kestrel Energy. Always the same people, though. They'd open a shaft, pull out what they could, and then disappear before anyone got wise." "Why hasn't anyone done anything?" Silas asked. Reed offered a thin, sad smile. "Because no one who matters ever lost anything." Silas left with copies of everything. As he drove home, a hot stone of anger settled in his chest. They had used his land, exploited his family's trust, turned the earth into a hidden factory, and left behind nothing but poisoned puddles and rotting wood. And now, decades later, they were still at it, still digging, still taking. That night, unable to sleep, he sat at his kitchen table with all the papers spread out before him. The photograph, the survey, the map. The name Kestrel Energy kept appearing in the margins of reports, always listed as a consulting firm or a logistics partner, never as the company in charge. It was a shell, a phantom, and Elko. Could that be Midland Boring Logistics? The letters fit, the location fit, the tunnel fit. He scribbled notes until the first light of dawn. The next day he called Marcus again. This time the man answered with a new weight in his voice. Silas told him everything he had found about Midland, the old survey, the photograph, the shifting corporate names. There was a long silence on the line. "They've been here the whole damn time," Marcus said at last. "And we never knew." "They counted on that," Silas replied. They agreed to meet the following morning. This was no longer just about curiosity. It was about theft, about violation, and if no one else was going to unearth the truth, they would have to do it themselves. Silas stood at the edge of the sinkhole that evening as the light faded around him. He stared into the darkness, his jaw set, his fists clenched at his sides. The land beneath his feet wasn't just soil and roots anymore. It was a crime scene, and the ghosts, old, silent, buried ghosts, were beginning to stir. By the time morning came, Silas was already dressed and waiting on the porch, his hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had long since gone cold. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that promised heat later in the day but offered little now beyond a profound silence and stillness. The air hung heavy, and the fields that once sang with life now seemed hushed, as though the earth itself was waiting, listening. Marcus's truck pulled into the gravel drive right on time, his familiar silhouette behind the wheel casting a long shadow through the dust. As he stepped out, he gave Silas a single, sharp nod. It was not a greeting, but a confirmation. They were both beyond words now. What they were about to do wasn't some idle curiosity or harmless exploration. This was about reclaiming something, not just answers, but truth, and perhaps even justice. Silas climbed into the passenger seat without a word, and Marcus pulled back onto the road. They drove south toward the state line, passing through a landscape of fields, fences, and distant homes. Neither man spoke for the first 20 minutes. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was focused, a shared weight distributed evenly between them. Their destination was a small environmental research station nestled between the highway and a dying creek bed, a place where Marcus's niece, Dr. Eris Corbin, worked as a field ecologist. She was sharp, determined, and had once taken on a major agricultural corporation over pesticide runoff and won. If anyone could help them, it was her. Eris met them in the parking lot, a clipboard in one hand, her dark hair pulled back into a practical bun, and a look in her eyes that suggested she had little time for pleasantries. Silas laid everything out quickly: the tunnel, the collapse, the smell of sulfur, the burned beam with the initials, and the documents he had unearthed from the archives. As he spoke, Eris's expression shifted from guarded to intensely focused. "So, you believe there is active industrial activity beneath your land, undocumented and ongoing?" she asked. Silas nodded. "I don't just think it. I've seen it. And you're saying the same company that was drilling illegally in the 60s might be doing it again under a different name?" "That's what it looks like," Marcus said. "And it's big. Real big." Eris stared at them both for a moment, then gestured toward her workshed. "I have sensors, samplers, infrared cameras, and enough protective gear to survive a chemical spill. Let's load up." An hour later, they stood once more at the edge of the sinkhole. The sun was directly overhead now, casting deep shadows into the chasm. Eris strapped on a mask and headlamp, clipped a device to her belt that monitored air quality, and descended first, her movements efficient and practiced. Silas followed, then Marcus, all three of them swallowed by the dark, earthy maw. Inside the tunnel, the air was even worse than before. The heat clung to their skin like oil, and the sulfurous smell was sharper, more insistent. Eris's device beeped softly every few seconds, recording the fluctuations in gas concentration and temperature. The walls of the tunnel pulsed faintly in their flashlight beams, the black veins glistening with a sweat-like moisture. As they moved deeper, Eris paused frequently to collect soil samples, scrape residue from the walls, and snap photographs. The geometric lines embedded in the tunnel walls were clearer now, their symmetry too precise to be anything but engineered. They passed the spot where Silas had found the charred beam and the partial company name. Eris crouched beside it, her gloved fingers brushing the markings, and took several high-resolution close-ups. "There's more than just evidence here," she said softly. "There's intent." Farther in, the tunnel branched. They took the right fork, which sloped downward at a shallow incline. The floor grew slick, the puddles deeper, and lined with an oily film that shimmered in the light. Eris knelt beside one, uncapped a vial, and filled it. The smell that rose from the liquid was unmistakable, petroleum, raw and pungent. "Crude oil," she confirmed. "Unrefined. Someone's been drilling recently." They pressed on. The tunnel widened again and the temperature rose. Silas could feel sweat trickling down his back, soaking into his shirt. The walls here were reinforced with rusted metal ribs, and old cables hung from the ceiling like vines in a forgotten cave. At the far end, tucked against the left wall, was a metal box, half buried and rusted, its lid askew. Inside were binders sealed in plastic, brittle papers, and several rolled-up blueprints. Eris lifted one out carefully and unfolded it against the tunnel wall. The lines were faint but visible, a schematic of the tunnel network beneath Silas's property, labeled with shafts, pressure valves, and collection nodes, terms that belonged in an oil field, not on a family farm. One of the pages bore the Kestrel Energy logo in the corner, dated just 2 years prior. Silas felt his knees weaken. "They're still using it, and they've expanded it." Eris added, "Look at this. This isn't just under your land. It goes beneath your neighbors. This whole grid is a web. You're right in the center." Marcus cursed under his breath. Eris took photos of every page, then packed the binders carefully into her satchel. The beeping from her air monitor grew faster. "We need to keep moving. The gas levels are spiking." They followed the tunnel farther, their path lit only by headlamps and the occasional flicker of their flashlights bouncing off wet stone and metal. Ahead the sound changed, a low hiss, steady and mechanical. They approached cautiously, and as they rounded the next bend, they saw it. A rusted pipe ran along the base of the wall, its seams cracked and leaking thick black oil that pooled in a trough dug into the earth. A pump sat beside it, old but still running, its vibrations barely audible over the hum. Eris approached and took a video, noting the serial numbers stamped into the housing. "This is industrial grade," she said, "and it's powered, which means someone is maintaining it." Silas stared at the pipe, watching the oil ooze and collect. "This is theft," he whispered. "They've been stealing from us for decades." They backtracked carefully, avoiding the unstable spots, retracing their steps by the scratches Silas had made on the wall. At the beam, Eris paused again, this time pulling a small ultraviolet flashlight from her bag. She scanned the area, and the charred wood glowed faintly under the light. "Chemicals, residues, signs of heat exposure." She stood, her expression grim. "They tried to destroy evidence, but they missed a lot." When they emerged into the daylight, blinking and coated in dirt and sweat, the weight of what they had discovered clung to them like a second skin. Silas sat on the grass beside the hole, staring into nothing. His farm, his family's land, had been violated. And not just once, but continuously, methodically, like a parasite feeding in the dark. "We have to expose this," he said quietly. "We can't let them keep doing it," Eris nodded. "We have what we need to start. Samples, photos, documents. It's a start." Marcus stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. "They're not going to go down easy." "Then we don't go down either," Silas said. The wind picked up, rustling the tall grass in the field. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the soil. Silas looked out over the land, his land, and felt something shift inside him. He was no longer just a farmer, no longer just a caretaker. Now he was something else, a witness, a defender. Beneath the skin of the earth the truth had stirred, and now it was ready to rise. The night was long and restless. Silas lay in bed with the windows open, the soft chirping of crickets mixing with the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But none of it could calm the storm in his mind. The discoveries of the day clung to him like a second skin, the smell of oil, the eerie hum of machinery, the blueprints in Eris's bag, now hidden under his kitchen floorboards. Even after a hot shower, the sulfur scent lingered faintly on his hands. He stared at the ceiling until the pale light of dawn began to creep across the walls, and even then sleep did not come. Outside, the world seemed still. The fields were quiet, the animals subdued, as if the land itself had sensed the intrusion and recoiled. Silas stepped out into the heavy morning air. The sky was the color of iron, with low-hanging clouds promising another sweltering day. He walked to the edge of the sinkhole, now partially cordoned off with warning tape Eris had insisted on placing, and stood there in silence. The tunnel was still there, gaping like an old wound. Nothing stirred inside, but Silas no longer trusted the quiet. Beneath the surface he could feel it, activity, motion, secrets. He spent the rest of the morning making copies of the documents they had found, carefully labeling each page, organizing the soil and liquid samples Eris had left with him in sealed bags. She was planning to deliver the originals to a contact at the State Environmental Office. Someone she claimed was trustworthy, but she had warned him, without public pressure, without a broader spotlight, the system would likely stall or bury it. That was how these companies survived. Delay, confuse, obscure. Silas wasn't ready to let that happen. By late afternoon, as he was feeding the cattle near the eastern fence line, he felt it, first as a vibration underfoot, then as a deep, unnatural rumble that rose from the earth like thunder in the bones. The cows grew agitated, turning in place, lowing anxiously. One of them backed into the fence, snapping a wooden post clean in half. Silas dropped the feed bucket and turned toward the southern field. The sound intensified, louder now, a roaring pulse that grew and grew until it became a sudden explosion, sharp, violent, and close. The ground shook beneath him. He staggered, catching himself against the fence. His eyes wide as a column of black smoke shot into the sky from beyond the tree line at the far end of the field. A second later came the wind, a hot rushing wave that carried with it dust, debris, and a foul stench that coated his tongue and burned his throat. Silas ran. He reached the hill just as a second, smaller blast shook the earth again, this one muffled but no less devastating. The trees near the edge of the field were bent at odd angles, their roots torn from the soil. The grass was flattened in a perfect arc around a new crater. The earth had collapsed inward, swallowing part of the ridge, and in the center of the blast zone was a twisted heap of metal piping and machinery, still steaming. He stood there staring until a piece of red plastic fluttered past his feet. He caught it without thinking. It was thin, like packaging material, but printed across its surface in bold black letters were 3 unmistakable characters: TNT. It hadn't been a natural collapse. It had been sabotage. Silas's hands curled into fists, his chest rising and falling with short, shallow breaths. They had detonated part of the tunnel, destroyed evidence, and nearly taken out his land along with it. The rage that filled him then was quiet, cold, and absolute. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. Whoever these people were, they were dangerous, and they were desperate. He returned to the house and locked the doors. Then he picked up the phone and called Marcus. By nightfall, they were seated at Marcus's kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey between them, the red TNT scrap laid out flat under a lamp. Iris had joined them as well, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the images from their last tunnel excursion. She looked up only when Silas slid the plastic toward her. "They blew part of it," he said. She studied the material, turned it over, sniffed it. "This is commercial-grade controlled demolition." Someone knew exactly where to place it. "They're covering their tracks," Marcus said, "or trying to scare us off." "They won't," Silas added. They discussed their options late into the night. Going to the police with only a name and some blueprints would accomplish nothing. The local sheriff was known to be friendly with energy interests, and even if he wasn't, they lacked proof that connected the operation directly to Kestrel or MBL. They needed more. Something undeniable, a photograph, a person, a name. Eris suggested going public, the press, a sympathetic journalist. But even that could backfire. If the company suspected exposure was imminent, they might destroy the rest of the tunnel system or threaten others. What they needed first was documentation, hard, verifiable evidence of an ongoing operation, images of the machines in use, samples being extracted, and people actively involved. They planned to return the next day at dawn. Back at home, Silas hardly slept. The explosion had disturbed more than just the land. His trust in the world had shifted. All his life he had believed in the quiet safety of rural existence, the idea that if you worked hard and kept to yourself, the land would reward you with peace. But now he saw how easily that peace could be stripped away, how those with power could hollow out the ground beneath a man without so much as knocking on his door. He woke before sunrise, dressed in silence, and packed his bag with gloves, extra batteries, the waterproof camera Eris had given him, and a crowbar for good measure. When Marcus and Eris arrived, they didn't speak. There was no need. The mission had changed. They reached the tunnel before the sun had fully risen. The air was thick and still, the only sounds their footsteps in the grass and the occasional rustle of leaves. The opening to the tunnel yawned before them, darker than they remembered. Silas led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Inside, the tunnel was unchanged at first, the smell, the heat, the oppressive silence. But deeper in, near where they had previously turned back, new signs emerged. Fresh footprints in the damp soil, recent scuff marks along the wall where equipment had been dragged. The cable lines, once limp and forgotten, were now taut and humming faintly with power. They reached a narrow passage Eris hadn't noticed before, half concealed behind a stack of broken crates. It led downward, steep and slick, into a lower chamber. As they descended, a soft, rhythmic sound became audible, machinery, pumps, and voices. They reached a wide cavern, lit by industrial lights bolted to the ceiling. In the center stood a massive rusted machine, churning with slow, deliberate motion. Thick pipes fed into it from both sides, pumping crude oil into waiting vats. Around it moved 3 men in blue jumpsuits, their faces hidden by masks, their bodies focused on their work. Silas froze. The insignia on their uniforms was unmistakable. MBL. He raised the camera and began to record, slowly, methodically, taking in every detail, the faces, the equipment, the tanks, the leaking pipes. Eris followed suit, snapping photos from every angle. Marcus stood near the entrance, keeping watch. They had what they came for. But then a radio crackled from somewhere deeper in the tunnel, followed by hurried footsteps. Silas motioned for retreat. They backed out quickly, avoiding loose gravel, retracing their steps to the main corridor. Only when the light of the entrance came into view did they allow themselves to breathe. Outside, they didn't speak. The wind moved through the trees above them like an exhale. The evidence was real, weighty in their bags. Proof they had it now. Later that night, Silas sent copies of the footage to 3 places: Eris's contact at the Environmental Bureau, a journalist she trusted in the city, and a secure cloud account she had set up just in case. As he sealed the samples and labeled the photos, he felt a shift within himself. Not just anger now, but purpose. They had struck a second blow, but it would be their last. The morning came cloaked in silence, but it was the kind of silence that carried weight. It was not the peace of dawn or the hush of nature still waking. It was the silence before movement, before confrontation, before truth collided with consequences. Silas stood at the edge of the field, the same spot where days earlier a blast had torn the earth open and scattered fragments of a stolen industry across his family's land. The crater remained, though now partially cordoned off by a makeshift barrier of rope and warning signs. Birds no longer landed nearby. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass over it. He had spent the night turning over the images they had captured, the glowing footage of oil flowing through rusted pumps, the insignias on the uniforms, the serial numbers etched into machinery, the precise geometry of an illegal operation unfolding beneath his soil. It was all real now, undeniable and present. No longer myth, no longer suspicion. He had video, samples, documents, and now names. The footage had been shared with trusted hands, but trust was fragile and time was short. If they waited too long, the company would vanish again like smoke, just as it had in generations past. The plan was clear: one more trip into the tunnels, deeper than before, to gather every last shred of evidence. The core of the operation had to be exposed, not just the machinery, but the people, the control systems, the records that proved intentional exploitation and decades of a cover-up. Silas wasn't just acting for himself now. He was acting for his father, who had never known what was stolen from beneath him, for his grandfather, who had tilled this land while men in hard hats tapped what lay below, for his neighbors, who might also be standing above silent thefts and never know it. Marcus arrived first, driving up in his usual dust-covered truck, his jaw tight and his eyes shadowed with something deeper than fatigue. Aris followed not long after, this time with 2 sets of spare batteries, 3 sealed sample kits, and a reinforced waterproof camera. Her face was calm, but Silas could see the tension behind her eyes, the stiffness in her jaw. She understood what this meant. She had known since the moment she saw the first glistening oil stain on the soil. They were walking back into danger, and this time they couldn't afford to retreat early. They made their descent just after 8, once the sun had risen, far enough to cast full light across the rim of the crater. The tunnel welcomed them with its usual cocktail of heat, fumes, and silence. But now it felt different, like a corridor waiting to collapse. The walls were damp, streaked with new rivulets of oil and condensation. Silas moved with purpose, following the familiar path to the lower chambers, past the old beam, past the fork where they had previously turned right. Today they turned left. This new passage sloped downward more steeply than the others. The floor was slick with black residue, the air thick and unkind. A faint humming greeted them early, mechanical and rhythmic, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. The deeper they went, the clearer it became. This was the center, not the edge, not the outer layer of an operation, but its beating core. The tunnel opened into a cavernous space, wide enough to hold a barn and tall enough for a 2-story scaffold to stretch toward the ceiling. Light poured from mounted fixtures, screwed into support beams, casting a harsh white glare across metal grates, fuel tanks, and a central command panel surrounded by glass screens. There were 3 people inside, 2 in full jumpsuits, their backs turned, and 1 seated at the console. Silas raised his hand slowly in motion for silence. Eris crept forward, her camera rolling, her breathing shallow behind her mask. Marcus remained by the entrance, his eyes scanning the tunnel behind them. Silas stepped closer, his heart pounding in rhythm with the distant hum of the machinery. He focused on the console, on the illuminated company logo pulsing on the screen, Kestrel Energy. There it was, full and undeniable. Not a shell name or initials, not a guess. The company responsible. The man at the console spoke into a headset, his voice low and hurried. Pressure on shaft 12 is rising faster than expected. Relay the backup valve now. We can't afford another surface breach this week. Silas's chest tightened. Another breach. This wasn't an isolated accident. It was routine, a calculated risk in a decades-long theft. He raised his camera and zoomed in on the screen as RS took stills of the scaffolding and machinery. The entire room was a command center, and from the schematic displayed across the wall-mounted monitor, it was clear that the tunnel system stretched for miles, beneath farms, beneath creeks, maybe even beneath the town. Eris moved to the far wall where a set of cabinets lined the steel siding. She pulled one open slowly, revealing folders stacked neatly inside. Each was labeled with field numbers, dates, and production yields. She opened the top file and held it out for Silas to see. It was a report, 15 years of records tracking extraction rates, chemical usage, and inspection cycles. His name wasn't on it, but the coordinates at the top matched his southern field. He took pictures of every page, his hand shaking now, not with fear, but with fury. These weren't accidents. These weren't oversights. This was a system, a quiet, calculated theft stretching back decades, hidden under the very feet of those who were told they owned the land. Then came the sound. A clatter near the far wall, metal on concrete. One of the workers turned, his eyes locking with Silas's. For a moment, everything froze. Then the man shouted, "Hey!" Silas turned and ran. Eris stuffed the files into her pack and followed. Marcus was already pulling back into the main tunnel, motioning frantically. Footsteps pounded behind them, and voices echoed off the walls. They moved fast, ducking through the narrower passageways, past the pump room, past the cracked valve near the oil trough, back into the old section where the lights were dim and the ceiling dripped with stale condensation. They reached the main shaft and climbed out one by one, emerging into the light, gasping and streaked with dirt. Marcus spun around and aimed his flashlight down the hole, but no one followed. The chase had ended below for now. They didn't waste time. Eris drove straight to her contact in the city, handing over the files and digital copies of every image and recording. Silas, meanwhile, returned to the house and called every local journalist, every independent environmental watchdog he could find. He sent the footage to Eris's reporter friend, to the national paper that had once exposed a water contamination scandal, even to a state representative whose office had promised transparency during campaign season. By nightfall, the story had begun to spread. The footage went live on a city news outlet, then bounced to social media. The photos of the Kestrel control room, the oil-streaked soil, the workers in uniform, the schematics, all of it was there, public, irrefutable. That night, Silas stood at his kitchen window and watched the darkness press against the glass. The wind rustled the grass outside, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The land was still. The silence had returned, but it was no longer a silence of ignorance. It was the breath before the reckoning. Beneath the ground, the voices that had once whispered in hidden tunnels had been dragged into the light, and the men who had stolen from the earth would now have to answer to it. The morning after the story broke was unlike any other Silas had known in his life. The sun still rose the same way, brushing soft gold across the tops of the fields, and the dew still clung to the blades of grass as it always had. But the silence that once made his land feel sacred now vibrated with unseen movement. He could feel it in the soil under his boots, in the hum of distant engines that didn't belong to any farm, in the uneasy tension that lurked behind the ordinary. Everything felt like a held breath. It began quietly, as all great reckonings do. A county patrol car parked at the edge of his property around 8 in the morning. 2 deputies stepped out, their faces unreadable, and walked to the front door with slow, deliberate steps. Silas greeted them on the porch, his posture straight, his heart steady. They didn't question him. They asked if he was willing to accompany them to the sheriff's office and provide a formal statement regarding what he had uncovered. He nodded without hesitation. There was nothing left to hide. Inside the station, a different kind of quiet settled. He sat in a room that smelled of dust and stale coffee, where the hum of fluorescent lights filled every space between words. A young officer transcribed everything: how Silas had found the sinkhole, the descent into the tunnel, the discoveries made, the evidence collected. Eris arrived with a printed dossier of the photographs and copies of the sample analysis results. Marcus came too, silent and watchful, placing the red plastic scrap from the explosion on the desk like an unspoken accusation. The sheriff was not a man prone to emotion. He listened with narrowed eyes, occasionally leaning back in his chair with his arms folded, his expression unreadable. But when Eris laid out the blueprints of the tunnel network and pointed to the corporate logos embedded in the documentation, something changed. He excused himself, took the files into a back office, and did not return for nearly half an hour. When he did, he wasn't alone. Two plainclothes state investigators followed behind him, one with a notepad, the other with a small black briefcase. They introduced themselves quietly, then asked to see the original evidence. Iris produced her sealed samples and handed over the digital copies. Silas could see it in their faces. They already knew this was bigger than their jurisdiction. By evening, the farm was no longer quiet. Unmarked SUVs rolled onto the property first. Then came utility trucks with ground-penetrating radar equipment. Men and women in protective gear walked the fields, marking soil, drilling test cores, comparing notes. Tents went up along the southern field. Floodlights were erected near the sinkhole. Silas stood by the barn, his arms folded, watching as his land was transformed into something between a crime scene and a battlefield. The workers didn't speak to him. They moved with the confidence of people following orders from far above, but he knew better than to assume silence meant ignorance. Word had spread. The images had reached the evening news. Regional outlets had already begun spinning the story. Farmer uncovers illegal oil network beneath historic land. More were calling each hour, asking for statements, interviews, access. Silas declined them all. He didn't want to be a spectacle. He wanted justice. The first arrest came 2 days later, not in his county, but in a neighboring one, where a Kestrel subsidiary maintained a satellite office disguised as an agricultural supply chain consultancy. 3 men were taken into custody: a project manager, a site engineer, and a logistics officer. None of them resisted. According to the Newswire, one had even volunteered the names of others involved, citing years of guilt. The documents found in the tunnel were authenticated by independent auditors. The oil samples matched recent refinery logs from a Kestrel partner facility 300 miles south. Within a week, subpoenas were issued. Corporate offices were raided. More names surfaced. Silas watched all of this unfold from his porch. Reporters still waited outside his gate most days. Sometimes he waved. Most times he ignored them. The land was healing beneath his feet, but he knew better than to believe it would happen quickly. What had been poisoned over decades could not be mended in days. There was remediation to be done. Eris had coordinated a team to oversee soil restoration, groundwater protection, and tunnel stabilization. Temporary funding came from a federal environmental emergency fund. Eventually, court-ordered restitution would be assigned, but the damage ran deeper than any dollar amount. His southern field would never be the same, but it would live. One afternoon, he walked the edge of that field and paused near the old crater. It had been partially filled now, the edges reinforced with natural barriers to prevent further collapse. He knelt down and touched the earth with his bare hand. It was dry but stable, warm under the sun, and no longer reeked of oil and sulfur. He remembered planting corn here with his father, his own hands too small to push the seeds deep enough, his father laughing and guiding his fingers. He remembered his grandfather standing at the far ridge, shouting about rain in the distance. He remembered the feeling that this land had always been his. And now he knew why that feeling had become clouded with confusion. Something had been stolen from his family, from his memory, from his birthright, but he had taken it back. Later that week, a formal ceremony was held at the courthouse. The mayor read a proclamation recognizing Silas for his courage, vigilance, and service to the public trust. Silas accepted it quietly, shaking hands with men who only months ago would have dismissed him as a paranoid farmer. He stood behind the podium only once, saying simply that the truth had been buried, but the land had remembered. That was all. The compensation came in stages, some financial, tied to land use and crop loss, some logistical, including permanent access to water purification systems, upgraded soil management infrastructure, and federal oversight of future drilling permissions within a 10-mile radius. More than once, Kestrel Energy offered to settle privately, a non-disclosure agreement attached. Silas refused them all. Eris continued her work on the environmental side, overseeing replanting initiatives and documenting the long-term recovery. Marcus returned to his quiet routines, occasionally helping Silas with fencing or repairs. But something had changed in all of them. They had seen what lay beneath, and they would never forget it. A year passed. The farm bloomed again. Wildflowers returned along the edge of the southern fence. The bees that had once vanished found their way back. The crops grew taller, thicker. The soil, enriched with new care and protection, produced yields higher than Silas had seen in 20 years. But more than that, the weight was gone. The silence of the land was once again peaceful, not haunted. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky bled orange and lavender, Silas stood on his porch holding a glass of sweet tea. The fields rustled in the breeze. Somewhere near the barn, a fox darted past the fence line, disappearing into the tall grass. The earth was whole again, and though its memory would never fade, it had forgiven. Not forgotten, but forgiven. He didn't need to look at the framed photographs or the clippings pinned to the wall. He remembered it all, the hole in the earth, the stolen oil, the names, the tunnel, the fire, the silence. And he remembered the moment it all began to shift, not when the ground opened, but when he chose not to look away. The land had been whispering for decades, and finally someone had listened.